Welcome again, everyone, and thank you to those of you in the room and those of you joining us online. This is the final session of the first day of a workshop for the faculty and administrators of the Global Network for Advanced Management. And this workshop has been a collaboration with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. My name is Stuart DeCue. I'm the Program Director of the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, which is a joint initiative between the School of Management and the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. We're thrilled to be the host for this workshop, and really in particular want to thank, before we begin, all of the faculty members and all the collaborators from different organizations who traveled to New Haven this summer to work with us over the course of this week. So many thanks to all of you, and many thanks to those of you who are fighting off jet lag right at the moment in this room. We deeply appreciate it. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's discussion. Brad Gentry is a professor in practice at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Yale School of Management. He is the faculty director of this Yale Center for Business and the Environment. And is a catalyst on campus for interdisciplinary partnerships between faculty and a catalyst for new opportunities where we can engage with businesses through the center in creative, flexible ways. So this past semester, Brad taught Yale's first course through the Global Network to 12 different business schools in the Global Network called Natural Capital, Managing Risks and Opportunities in Global Resource Systems. An experiment in online education, an experiment in engaging with the World Business Council, and a very successful one at that. And so Brad is going to continue to lead us on this discussion and journey through the center and have a stimulating discussion with the panelists on how we can continue to push business education in different ways through the course of the next 6 years. So Brad, please.
Just one quick announcement. We just want to remind everybody that this is being streamed online and encourage for those of you that have questions to use the push to talk on the microphones in front of you, just so the people online can also get your questions. Thank you, Brad.
So, welcome everybody. Thank you again, Stuart. And Stuart and Jen and others here at the Center for Business and the Environment are proof of that great adage that what managers do is hire great people and get out of their way. And what we've done for this panel is assemble a panel of great people, and we're going to get out of their way a little bit. I've got some questions to get them started, but they've assured me that almost regardless of what I ask, they're going to say what they want to say. So I look forward to a lot of back and forth here. And we have a wonderful array of perspectives. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. Christine Bader is an author of The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist, When Girl Meets Oil, talking about her time at British Petroleum, at BP, doing social projects, social aspects of projects in many different parts of the world, and then on secondment to the UN to work on human rights and related issues. And I'll let her talk about sort of the implications of all of that for what she sees about sustainability and training of folks who are interested in sustainability, or training of managers more generally, and their views of the sustainability world. Kevin Moss at the far end is the head of Net Good at BT for North America, where Net Good's a part of BT's Better Future program, focused on society living within the constraints that we talked about earlier today around the planetary boundaries. He's been working on sustainability issues at BT since 2007, both at the corporate level and in the UK and in globally. And then finally, directly to my right, Dr. Terry Yosie, President and CEO of the World Environment Center, which has been working with its member companies, global companies, to think about how best to integrate sustainability in their operations, their supply chains, their products, their educational efforts around the world. So you can see that we have this great array of perspectives. In the teleconference calls that we had to get ready, they already entered into a great debate. I'm sure that they are happy to take whatever questions you want. And so why don't we kick it off? You know, if you think about what MBA programs say they do, is that they train leaders School of Management here at Yale says it trains leaders for business and society. If we think about sustainability challenges and planetary boundaries and Action 2020, what do the leaders of the future look like? What skill sets do they have, and what should we be training them for? Would any of you like to go first? Or should I pick on somebody, or we just go down the panel? Terry, I'm going to pick on you.
Okay. I think we've already entered an era of unprecedented change, not only in the private sector, but the public sector and the nonprofit sector as well. And I think what that means for not only management education, but for leadership development is an array of new skill sets that will be required. And I categorize these skill sets into 3 buckets. One dealing with skills and mindsets, second one dealing with leadership strategies, and the third dealing with systems. And let me give you just a brief set of illustrations of what I mean by each of those. I think in the category of skills and mindsets, we are now and will continue to require not only CEOs and other senior business executives, but leaders of all kinds of organizations to have to know how to manage and work their way through complexity and disruption. And I think the intensification of complexity and disruption will exceed anything we've experienced to date. Let me just give you 2 quick examples. So we all know that the U.S. National Security Agency has been conducting massive operations against Brazil for the last several years. It's personally listened to President Dilma Rousseff's telephone calls. It's listened in on the discussions at Brazil's mission to the United Nations, at its embassy in Washington, and all of its major economic ministries. This has really roiled Brazil's relationships with the U.S. to the extent that President Rousseff canceled a visit to Washington. Brazil is still very upset about this, and one manifestation of this complexity and disruption just happened to Boeing aircraft, because President Rousseff was about to make a decision on whose airplanes it was going to buy. Guess what? Brazil didn't get that contract. Why? Because of the National Security Agency spying operation. So how could Boeing ever have fathomed that it was going to be the victim of something as far-fetched from its business model as NSA spying? Another example, closer to the sustainability arena, is if you had to list an American company that would be on the environmental community's top 5 list of environmental bad guys, I would say there's a good chance that Consol Energy, headquartered in Pittsburgh, would be one of those top 5 companies. It's a company that historically has not only been skeptical of climate change, it's denied climate change. It's contributed massive amounts of money to trying to prevent both the Obama administration as well as the US Congress from enacting greenhouse gas controls. So you would say, here's probably a good example of what Al Gore is talking about when he refers to companies that are going to have stranded assets, right? Wrong. Despite the senior management's attitudes toward climate change, Consol, for the last 5+ years, has been gradually and systematically migrating its portfolio away from coal, and now is primarily a natural gas company. The fact that its business operations are adjacent to the Marcellus Shale gas field in western Pennsylvania gives it a ready access to providing fuel for the utility market. So here's a company that is clearly behaving very differently than its publicly expressed ideology, because it sees the disruption to its markets that are already happening, irrespective of what it thinks about climate change. So to me, that's an example of the bewildering array of complexity and disruption that's facing companies, not only in the US, but around the world. Another bucket of skill sets and needs of leadership going forward, I would say applies in the area of collaboration for market scale. This is a very difficult thing to do, not only for companies, but also governments and NGOs. For one thing, if you're a global company and you're looking for a global partner in the NGO community, good luck, because there's only a few of them that have the global level of scale to be your partner in the various regions of the world where you operate. Similarly, governments tend not to be very good partners for companies on global issues because they're very nationalistic and focused on certain territories. I think one of the really good examples of how a company built a global collaboration strategy was what Coca-Cola did on global water strategy issues. Here it went through a very methodical process of trying to identify partners in a very systematic way. And the partners it chose have global scale. The UN Development Program, the U.S. Agency for International Development, WWF, the Nature Conservancy. Interestingly enough, when you collaborate on a global scale, you have to rethink your governance model. The partners have to be as accountable to you as you are to them, and that's not easy either. One last example I'll give in terms of systems. I think that when we think about system change, we frequently are identifying individuals such as Henry Ford, who obviously was a major system level change manufacturer. You could say that Andy Grove was a major system changer in recognizing the alignment between microprocessors and personal computers. Who's the sustainability system level changer? I think aside from Paul Pullman's name, who else would you put on that list? And I think that's both the promise and the shortcoming of sustainability leadership these days is there are very few people in the business community that you could really say are system-level change makers at this stage. So those would be just some thoughts I have initially on leadership in the future.
Great, thank you. Christine, you've had a lot of different perspectives on leadership, given the path you've been on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I could not agree more with Terry, what you just outlined. And I'll give a personal take on it. I'll use my few introductory minutes to share my story. Not just because I've done some interesting things in some interesting places, but because I graduated from this school with my MBA 14 years ago. And I've had, a pretty good career by some measures, but by others, as a sustainability professional, I have failed deeply. I worked at BP for 9 years. I'll share the story, but what I have become really passionate about now is understanding that there is a really big gap today between what we all know companies must do and have to do, and what is it like to be that person deep in the company, not in the C-suite, but deep inside the company, who's actually the person who has to do it. And why do they fail, even with the best intentions of their CEO and of their department, right? So I got out of here in 2000, and there wasn't an army of sustainability professionals to deploy. It wasn't really a job that you did. So I joined BP, I went out to Indonesia. The idea was that I was going to be a commercial analyst, flexing my new Excel skills to help do quantitative analysis on a lot of the assets that BP had acquired with its takeover of Arco, many of which were in Indonesia. So I was doing that, I was crunching financial and production data, but there was one project in particular that was proving really interesting. And not from a technical or economic or financial perspective, it was a very straightforward project. Nice, big, fat, juicy gas field that sat really close to the surface in a bay, so very easy to extract. BP was going to build a liquefied natural gas processing plant onshore, and that's pretty straightforward. BP's done that in lots of places, but never in a place like this. It was in West Papua at the remote eastern tip of Indonesia. We were going to have to resettle a village of 127 households to make way for this plant, work with the Indonesian military, which is not known for their good community relations, and work in a place that had very little in the way of social infrastructure or government capacity, as we say politely. So again, this wasn't a thing that had a job title, but I put my hand up and said, whatever that is, that's what I want to work on. And that's what became my career. And from there, I went to China to do similar work on a petrochemicals joint venture, went to BP headquarters in London and worked with colleagues doing similar work around the world. And I left in 2008 to support a United Nations initiative on business and human rights, which ended in 2011 with a new set of standards, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But of course, what happened in the interim, the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And so that really made me question, well, hang on a second, what was that all about? What does it mean to have done the work that I did? I know I made a difference to those families and those communities around the projects that I worked on, but what we've been talking about all day is the need for transformational systemic change. And at that, clearly I failed. I did not manage to transform all of BP. But what does it mean to really do this work inside a company? So that disaster and my having to reflect on what do we really need to produce the leaders that we need and produce the companies producing the change that we all need, that's what compelled me to start talking to lots of friends and peers doing similar work in other companies and really try to understand why do they fail and what do we need in order to succeed. So I'll leave it at that by way of introduction.
Can you offer us a teaser, like one
Sure,
or two?
I can do a couple of
things you
teasers. I
learned?
mean, there were some themes which I think are very relevant to what skills business schools need to impart. And one of the most important, I think, is how we teach companies to reward and evaluate and promote people. Because one of the themes that emerged is that no one gets rewarded for what doesn't happen. And a lot of the work that I was doing and that my peers were doing inside other companies was preventative, right? But it's hard to reward for that. So one supply chain manager for a big multinational that I interviewed told me how livid she was when one of her colleagues received one of her company's internal awards, which are very prestigious in a big company, for managing a big safety disaster. And she was like, are you kidding me? I presented like 20 of those. Right, but how do you reward for that? So that's a teaser.
Yeah, that's a good one. So Kevin, you're going to have to follow up here. You've been in your position for a while at the company. What are you seeing in terms of effective leadership, either within the sustainability position or more generally?
Let me just a couple of words of introduction as well. Kevin Moss, BT, as in British Telecom, if you're not from the UK, it's worth spelling that out. We have about 3,500 people in North America, about 15,000 outside of the UK. So although we're a UK-oriented company, a big global business as well. And I look after our environmental strategy. Let me talk a little bit about a few thoughts on what your original question, what we're looking for from leaders of the future. I'd like to see, and I think everything I'm going to say coming from a completely different angle is completely consistent with everything you've both said. But in terms of actual individual capabilities, people who are willing to be disruptive and people who have the resilience to be disruptive. Because it's not easy to be disruptive. It involves risk, it involves transformational change, and you need a lot of resilience to be a leader in a large corporation, leading a company in that direction. The other ideas I have are all about a perspective and approach of what the role is of a leader in a large organization. I think global perspective is very important. I think, Terry, you've referred to this as well. The thing that corporations, I think, can bring that is difficult for national governments to bring is that global perspective. That idea that offshoring a job isn't taking something away from your home country. It might just as equally be putting something in another country and taking that global balance perspective that doesn't come from a sort of a biased national view. I think that global perspective is particularly important because that's something corporations bring that's very hard for national governments to bring. A stewardship approach to management and an appreciation of the broader role of a company in society, I think, are very important for the future. A broader role that is beyond the specific financial returns to shareholders. And please note, I'm not dismissing financial returns to shareholders. They're of key importance. If you don't make those, the company's not there. But I think it's important to understand and have an appreciation of a broader role for the company in society. Something I see today, particularly in the US where I live, but also in other countries, is folks working in the civil service and folks working in elected roles of government talk about how they've dedicated themselves to a career-serving society. And you don't really hear corporate leaders talk about how they're doing that. And I think the place we want to get to is where if you work in a corporation, you also not only say, but believe that in that role, you are fulfilling a service to society. And in that, I encapsulate the environment as well. So those are some of the things I'd like to see from leaders of the future.
So you all encouraged me to sort of go off script periodically. So I'm going to start with the willing to be disruptive part. Maybe there's a conversation there a little bit. if you're thinking about being willing to be disruptive, then you're also willing to get fired. Where's the balance between the two in terms of being, how do you calibrate being sufficiently disruptive to help to encourage transformational change versus being so disruptive that you lose your capacity to affect change? Would you like to start, Kevin, since you?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that from the perspective of my role as a sustainability practitioner, and I've written about this as well a few times on publicly, so I can say it publicly as well. Which is, to some extent, I think, as a sustainability practitioner, one needs to measure yourself by whether you are pushing the envelope to the point at which you feel uncomfortable sometimes. And if you don't sometimes push the envelope to the point at which you feel uncomfortable, and perhaps you're pushing the people around you further than they want to go, then you're not really doing the job. People sometimes ask me what I lose sleep over at night, expecting me to say climate change or an issue like that. And those issues obviously are important, but actually what I lose sleep over at night is my role one in which I am a pressure relief valve or the conscience of the company that allows the corporation to do the things it would have done anyway but feel okay about them, which is not what the role should be, as opposed to actually affecting change. And that's what I think the role should be. And that's what I lose sleep about, because I could do more bad than good if I haven't got that balance right. So I haven't answered the question, because I think in a way the only test of that is whether I feel that tension and stress myself. I don't think there's an absolute measure of it.
Christine or Terry? Christine, you want to comment
I'll
on that?
give just a slightly different take on that, which is that of the people who, thinking back on my experience and of the 36 people I interviewed for my book, it actually got to a point where they said, part of what keeps me going is this incremental change and these very small steps, which externally look totally minimal, right? Like, I got my company to launch a new policy or to sign on to a new voluntary initiative. And to the outside world, those things look pretty small, but they take a tremendous amount of internal work and alignment. When I came to my husband and said, we finally launched this new policy, at BP, and he was like, it took you like 18 months to launch 2 paragraphs. And I'm like, well, yeah, actually, it did. So I think that that everybody who I talked to, and myself included, talked about this balance between really trying to push and know that you've got to hit that point, but also feeling like, okay, these small steps actually do make a difference. And I do, at the end of the day, have faith that I am moving my big supertanker company in the right direction. Although, again, as we've talked about today, that's not quite good enough, right? That at some point you need to seek out these moments for really disrupting and really being transformative. But the incremental stuff is important, too, when you're inside these big companies every day.
I have a completely different answer than my colleagues.
Good.
I think business schools need to be more disruptive. I think there's a reason why there's a 17% decline in enrollments in MBA programs in the United States in the last 2 years. I think one of those reasons, beyond the high cost of an education, is the fact that a lot of students are not finding the MBA degree relevant to the kind of careers they want to create for themselves. I think a place to start for business schools to be more disruptive is to re-examine the shareholder value concept. I think a lot of business school deans are acting like they're either shills of Wall Street or they are totally ignorant about the history of corporate America. And I say that in the following context. Until Milton Friedman and Michael Jensen hijacked the argument over corporate valuation in the 1970s and substantially narrowed it to focus on the purpose of corporations being only to generate wealth for shareholders. Up until that time, there was well over a 100-year history of creating corporate charters as well as case law that went in the opposite direction. If you look at case law, and if you look at any corporate charter of a company in this country, the word shareholder value never appear. Rather, corporate charters reflect the fact that companies were to generate value and that the purpose of boards of directors was to govern in the best interests of the companies over time. So if anything, boards of directors have a lot more freedom than they're behaving as if they do, unless they have substantial conflicts of interest or unless they have not made a diligent effort to inform themselves around corporate decision-making. The courts are going to give them a wide berth of deferential treatment on how they manage the companies, even if in the short run the shareholders do not prosper and may even suffer. I don't know if that's being taught in American business schools. It is certainly being taught in many law schools. And so I would like to see business schools be somewhat more disruptive. In fact, I don't even think that's really disruptive. I think it's just discussing the reality of how the shareholder value concept came to be and what preceded it for hundreds of years. I think one of the reasons why so many global companies are being increasingly discomforted about the shareholder value concept is not only because of its short-term nature, it's because many of the business risks that companies are facing are systemic in nature and can't be valued on a quarterly basis. And so I would like to see business schools devote much more attention to systemic business risks and not just things that are going to go on quarter to quarter. I think they're failing to do a proper education for students. I think there's a disservice to economic leadership in this country if they don't do that. So business schools, deans, wake up.
So we'll have a chance to hear from this business school's dean in a little bit. And I believe his eyes are open in the back, so we're good. Kevin, you had said earlier that you wanted corporate leaders to talk about serving society. It seems to me that picks up on the same principle we were just talking about. But, when you're talking to your customers or your shareholders about their value sets around sustainability, are you seeing a disconnect there? Or are they saying, yeah, the company I buy from, the company I invest in should serve society?
We are seeing a disconnect. We actually held an online forum about a year ago with a whole bunch of companies discussing this stuff, and there's seems to me to be a fairly clear consensus that our investors and our customers, on the whole, don't reward us for making sustainable decisions. They don't necessarily punish us for making sustainable decisions, but they don't reward us. I've always actually found it interesting that it's often the same person with a different hat on. So I sort of have this picture in my mind of an individual reading the newspaper in the morning and reading a story of what a company's done that annoyed them, that angers them, and they're angry as a member of civil society. And let's say, I'm going to say for the sake of this, it's an oil company, because it's good for my little example. So they're angry reading the paper about this oil company doing something, and then they drive down the road on their way to work, and that oil company's gas station's on this side of the road where they are, and the other one's on the other side of the road, and it's a little awkward to cut across the traffic. So they go and become a customer of that company anyway. So they're not really punishing it or rewarding it for the other one for sustainable behavior. They get into work that day and they phone up their Schwab investment person, and the likelihood is they don't even ask the question of whether they're invested in that company. So I think they're the same person behaving in different ways depending on what hat they're wearing. And if it's the company they work for, they'll defend it to the hilt, whatever it's done. So I think one of the tricks we need to, one of the locks we need to unlock is how do we get people to take those values that they have with them when they read the paper in the morning and take those through and carry those through into their investor and their customer behaviors, so that we can then act as a company to meet those. And we have a leadership role to play there as well. I'm not relinquishing us of responsibility at all. We have a role to play there as well.
And it's interesting here because as more CEOs come in, they all mention sustainability as a key factor in their operations and the key factor in what they're looking to hire people to help on in a variety of different ways. Terry, I know that the World Environment Center has been working with more and more companies on this question of, how do companies attract the people and how do business schools train the people that companies need in this arena of more and more interest in sustainability, in resource issues, in social impacts, all of that. What are you seeing as sort of key takeaways from that work so far?
I think there are several dynamics in play. One is that by and large, the leading companies of the world, when it comes to the sustainability question, have moved beyond just having centralized corporate staff focus on sustainability. They've increasingly embedded sustainability into their functional units, whether they be in procurement, research and development, manufacturing, logistics. Increasingly, you see a number of chief financial officers now looking at sustainability from the standpoint of business risk evaluation and factors like that. So I think that's one set of drivers that's going on. I think the other is that many global companies, because they operate in so many regions of the world, are now becoming much more acutely sensitive to being able to attract the talent they will have to be successful both now and in the future. And so I think that sustainability is a powerful recruiting tool for these companies. And we're not just talking about consumer products companies, we're talking about companies in the extraction business, the manufacturing business, the services business, et cetera. And so what we're seeing at the World Environment Center through our work with both business and engineering schools and global companies is a more formal process for companies starting to ask what those talent needs are. And I think where there's a golden opportunity and where we're certainly focused going forward is to provide that forum and that focus where global companies and business and engineering schools can collaborate with each other at a much greater level of scale than previously. I really do not believe that companies and most universities know how to work with each other. I think their extent of collaboration is oftentimes philanthropic in nature, or it's because of a one-off project, or maybe because a company has a facility in a community where a university is located. But in terms of broader systemic integration of business and universities over a long period of time, I think that kind of collaboration is still absent in most cases. So part of what we're trying to do is identify the sweet spots where that collaboration can occur, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so I think that effort needs to be focused on three objectives. One is to greatly accelerate the transition of content and other information related to business operations into the classroom. Secondly, to provide students, as part of their formal university training, much more direct experience of business processes and cultures while they're still students. And thirdly, to give companies a much earlier look at talent before recruiters ever hit campuses. Companies send out recruiters who, by and large, don't know that much about sustainability. They're looking for specific sets of expertise around finance or marketing. And you're starting to see some interesting conversations in companies like DuPont and elsewhere, where the HR department and the campus recruiters are beginning to link up with the sustainability departments in the manufacturing centers. So I think if those three objectives of accelerating knowledge transfer, giving students real-world learning opportunities while still in class, and giving companies an ability to spot talent earlier than is typical, I think those are some fertile grounds for some really creative collaborations between business and universities.
And I was fortunate enough to go to an event that Terry organized in May, and I was talking to the Career Development Office here about what they were seeing in terms of recruiters and sustainability. And they said, well, some were starting to come in and ask for the compost-only catering services, but mostly they said that students were using it as a factor in figuring out with which companies they wanted to interview or with which companies they wanted to reach out to. So I think there is a lot happening there. Maybe Christine,
But
yeah.
what does that mean? I mean, does it mean that a student wants to go work at a company that I'm going to feel good about because I know that they have a nice program where they send people out in matching t-shirts to go paint a wall one day a year, but it has nothing to do with my day job? Like this, to me, I get the feel-good factor, but I think that it's completely beside the point. I mean, it's what kind of jobs are they recruiting people for, and what at the end of the day are people in that company paid to do all day? I mean, I think.
You want to comment on any of this? You want to jump in on any of this? discussion, either that point or the one before?
Well, I completely agree, and I had a tense discussion with somebody on a panel a couple of years ago who was talking about philanthropy and recycling and stuff, and I said, and how students were asking about that question when they came for jobs. And I mean, actually, to me, the first thing a student should think about when recruiting a company is the mission of that company, is the thing it's contributing to the world, a thing that I want to be part of, because it doesn't matter how much of those sort of feel-good things you do, if the mission of the company is not a mission you believe in and that you think makes a positive contribution, then it's you're eventually going to hit up against that wall at some point. So that should be the more important part of a decision for a graduate coming into a company.
I mean, I was interested in something that you said earlier, Kevin, though, about how you want people to be serving society. And what I see a lot working with companies in the tech sector is that a lot of internet companies, this is what people believe in that sector, that they are all about. They're about, be it democratizing the world's information or providing some app that's going to change the world. But what's so interesting about that sector is that they've done a not very good job of mitigating their risks to society too. Right? That people are talking about, like, I want to go in and save the world, but not recognizing the risks and the social impacts. And that I think that needs to be a part of how we think about the leaders of tomorrow too, right? That it's not just about enhancing sustainability, but recognizing that even the products that we believe are great have great risks too, and that social impact assessments and human rights impact assessments need to be part of that.
Yes, and I'm not going to sit here and try and defend my vertical,
no.
because and I think, well, let me use that to talk about. We've talked a lot earlier today about measurement systems and how do we measure 10% better and 70% better and that sort of thing. I think what you bring out are some of the true dilemmas that I think are at the heart of what it means to be a responsible company that simply aren't measurable. I don't believe are measurable. Maybe someone will come up with a way of measuring them, but how do you compare the value of freedom of speech with protection of the vulnerable? Where do you draw the line? For the specific example in my field is gambling and pornography over the internet. How do you protect the vulnerable compared to freedom of speech? Because one person's perspective of what is pornography is very different than another person's perspective, who may believe this is art and freedom of speech. And those things, there's a lot of discussion in the field about ROI and ROI and how do I prove the business case. That's a fundamental responsibility issue in my vertical, and I don't believe it's measurable. I believe it comes down to judgment and values and a feeling that your company has a responsibility towards society broader than just the measurable things. And I don't know how you teach that. So that's a piece where I don't know how to say to the folks here from schools, teach that thing, because I don't know how you teach it, but I do believe it's fundamentally important.
Do either of you want to comment on the things that are not measurable point?
Yeah, I'll disagree a little bit, just to try to disagree with you on something. But now on it not being measurable, I mean, NYU Stern has just set up a Center for Business and Human Rights. And they're doing that in part in response to the emergence of human rights as a framework for how we talk about and think about corporate responsibilities. And speaking to the folks there at Stern, they want to use human rights as the framework to talk about their students' responsibility as they become business leaders in society. And I think, and I'm biased having worked on these UN human rights principles for business, I think it's really helpful, because I think that a lot of the eye rolling about sustainability and CSR is that there is no universal declaration of CSR or sustainability. Nobody knows what we're talking about. So for some companies, it is the composting and recycling or sending employees out to go volunteer. But there is a universal declaration of human rights that is a list of 30 rights and freedoms that were agreed by the international community 60 years ago. They haven't changed. They're not gonna. And having worked in a company full of engineers, they love lists, right? So you give them the list of 30, and sure, it doesn't read like a business manual, so there's a little bit of translation that needs to happen, and there's a lot of effort going on around that. But if you start with this list and say, here are the 30 things, and there are some people trying to develop metrics around them, and we're not there yet, but having a list is a really good place to start. So I think that human rights is part of what I would like to see more business schools thinking about. I'm part of a teaching forum of people who teach business and human rights at universities around the world, but it is almost entirely law faculty. And I think we're missing an opportunity for business schools.
So that sort of takes us into policy actions in some respects. And I know that, Terry, you say, well, you know, businesses need to have business models and all that and things they can measure, but don't forget the policy side and don't say, you know, just let the markets be free, everything will be great. You know, what are you seeing on the policy intervention side?
Well, I'm actually becoming slightly more hopeful that the lagging indicator in sustainability, otherwise known as public policy, may be showing some signs of life. And the reason I say that is because I think it's starting to dawn on the legal community and corporations and others that there's an evolving framework that's emerging, or that could emerge, called value chain regulation. That is to say, rather than just regulating a smokestack or an individual factory or a single business sector, why not construct a regulatory framework that applies across an entire value chain? There is both legal and policy precedent for this. I had some experience with it directly in the early 1990s after the U.S. Clean Air Act was passed and the U.S. Congress required the petroleum industry to develop cleaner fuels. At that time, the U.S. EPA convened a regulatory process, but it wasn't limited to the petroleum industry. It included the automotive manufacturers. It included chemical companies that made fuel components. It included state and local governments. It included environmental groups. It included ethanol producers. Fast forward to 2007, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has developed a value chain approach to food safety, in which they're not only sending in inspectors to look at the grape fields or mango or avocado fields in various countries, they're also looking at what sanitation facilities are available in the fields so that the workers have clean hands when they're harvesting, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, on June the 2nd of this year, EPA proposes a climate regulation. Now, at first blush, and if you follow all of the noise in Washington and all of the policy and political debates, you would think this is primarily or exclusively a regulation of the utility industry to limit its CO2 emissions. I maintain it's a value chain-based regulation to set a new policy framework for how electricity is going to be generated. Because if you look at how that rule was structured, it wasn't just applying to utilities. It created an open competition and market for the natural gas industry, the coal industry, renewables, and many other sources of energy production, as well as energy efficiency, to all be part of this framework. In addition, local and state governments were at the table. In addition, there are regional compacts that are throughout New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. I find that when companies start looking at this a second time, there are less objections. Why? Because there are many more options on the table for dealing with this than there would be if this was strictly a regulation about limiting greenhouse gases from utilities. When you have this kind of collaboration going across the value chain, economics tend to work in your favor. The costs tend to be smaller. Innovation opportunities tend to rise. And guess what? When companies try to do this by themselves, they may run very directly into antitrust considerations. When the federal government is the convener of this process, the antitrust issues tend to melt away. So I think the policy framework of regulation by value chain has a very significant set of opportunities going forward.
Great. Christine or Kevin, do you want to, before we open it up for broader questions from the audience, any comments on the policy opportunities, constraints?
Yeah. I mean, one other trend that I'm seeing in terms of policy engagement by companies is part of what you've said, Terry, but it's collaborative initiatives or multi-stakeholder initiatives, right? And this is often to fill a regulatory gap until the government sort of catches up and does something
Does what it does.
useful. But in the meantime, so for example, in 2000, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights were launched. And that was an initiative started by a number of extractive companies, oil, gas, and mining companies, working with a number of human rights groups, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, convened by the UK and US government. And it was in response to Shell running into problems in Nigeria, BP in Colombia, and those companies rightly getting criticism from human rights groups, but then saying back to those human rights groups, we don't know what the rules of the road are, because again, we're operating in environments around the world where there aren't helpful rules. So help us. Let's work together and come up with a code of conduct. Fast forward 10 years, and we've seen something similar with internet companies, with the Global Network Initiative, which is Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, coming together with some of those same human rights groups, as well as some socially responsible investors and academic experts in free expression and privacy, to get together to come up with a voluntary code of conduct, which they can also use to engage with governments to say, look, here's what we've all come up with working together. Let's try to lobby for a policy framework that's actually more helpful than what exists today. So I think collaborating, there are some antitrust issues, but I think that a lot of the companies involved have recognized that some of these issues transcend competition, and there's always an antitrust sort of announcement at the beginning of every meeting, but that doesn't seem to be a problem. So I think the collaborative and multi-stakeholder initiatives are a really important trend.
Great. Kevin, did you want to?
Well, I agree. I think what's behind it for most companies is many of these issues are only a disadvantage, a short-term disadvantage. If you act on the issue and your competitors don't, they can be a short-term disadvantage. So if government hasn't acted to even the playing field, then these collaborations effectively overcome that short-term disadvantage, because you know everybody else is going to do it, and you can get beyond that point. So yeah, they work well for us.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I think there's plenty of topics around which to ask questions. I would just ask people, since we are live streaming, that if you want to ask a question, please hold the button down during the entire time you're asking the question, and also identify yourself, name and organization. So would anybody like to start off the questioning? Wow, I'm impressed. Must be late in the day and the jet lag from Europe is catching you. Yeah.
Yeah, Andy Mangan with the U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development. What about the public and the customers that are out there buying things? What happens as a disruptive example when an application becomes wildly popular that allows people to scan barcodes and determine human rights and the whole range of challenges that you're talking about? Will that be something that really moves companies down this pathway a little more aggressively?
So it already exists, and it hasn't. So Good Guide, does some of that. I mean, I'm pretty depressed about the role of the consumer in moving companies right now, in part because of exactly what Kevin said, that people behave inconsistently, and they do so in part because they have budget considerations or convenience considerations. And I suppose the important thing to recognize from that perspective is this is what I do for a living, and I have a lot of trouble being a responsible consumer for all of the same reasons. And so I've started playing this game with myself that I invite all of you to play with me, right? If I'm in Whole Foods and I'm saying, I don't know, the fair trade coffee is like $1 more per pound. I'm going to buy the slave trade coffee. So just started asking myself, what is the default, and why do we accept that? Right? So yeah, some of my money is in socially responsible mutual funds. Where's the rest of my money going? But we're clearly not there yet. And there are all these studies of if you've got 2 pairs of socks out and one of them is marked fair trade and one isn't, even if they're the same price, people don't buy the fair trade socks, right? Because they perceive the quality to be lower or whatever. And as soon as you bump the price up, people don't buy So I'm pretty depressed about the consumer piece in this, which is part of why I'm really interested in focusing on the people inside the companies, the people who are going to be the change agents and who are going to disrupt the company. So I'm a little depressed about it. I think it's important.
Kevin, you want to?
I'm depressed on some days, and I'm optimistic on other days. So the Good Guide is a great example. People don't have time to consider all the criteria, and the idea of scanning the barcode and then looking at the supply chain and deciding how am I going to evaluate the supply chain with the environmental issues, with the other issues, and decide it's just not going to happen. I think we're making their buying decision harder. I feel there are two places we have to look for effective change. One is machine-to-machine communication. So what we just talked about effectively was machine-to-person, where you as an individual have to make a difference. I think machine-to-machine communication in the form of things like automated cars, Nest thermostats, those sorts of things, where you actually make someone's life, you make the sustainable decision, the easy decision, and the better decision are the ones that are going to win through. I don't know whether that will create enough change, but that sort of where you actually take the decision out of the hands of the consumer and you automate it. That requires an awful lot of trust, though, on behalf of consumers, and that meets the intersection of the other issue, which is the power of brand. As corporations, we are very powerful. We are experts at using brand to effect change in society, to help people see they want to do things they perhaps hadn't even realized they wanted to buy before. And if we can think of our corporations in that broader sense and bring those brands to bear and that brand power to bear, then I think that, together with the other the machine-to-machine communications, could be enough for the change on my optimistic days.
Terry?
I think one of the biggest challenges the private sector will face for the foreseeable future is how to innovate, how to develop innovative products in advance of any consumer demand for them. About 40 years ago, Sony introduced a product for which there was no consumer demand because the concept hadn't yet existed. It was called the Sony Walkman. It was a category buster because it combined two separate worlds, the world of exercise and jogging and walking with the world of entertainment. People hadn't thought about that integration before, and so the Sony Walkman, which I think was the intellectual precursor of the iPod in some ways, was a category buster. Sony has had some difficulty replicating that kind of success since then. But if you look at today's companies, we're rapidly evolving into a disappearance of traditional business model boundaries. So car companies, which for 100+ years have relied upon the internal combustion engine fueled by hydrocarbons, are now entering a mobility phase where the future, which today is hybrid, the future will be hydrogen or some other kinds of fuel source, and they're asking the question, who's going to buy these vehicles? And the answer is not yet apparent, but yet they're still wanting to make the investments in innovation and the infrastructure that has to accompany that. Look at companies like Nestle and Unilever. 68% of Unilever's environmental footprint is originating from our use of their products. So when we wash our hair, when we clean our clothes, or when we eat foods that they provide, our use of their product is producing 68% of their footprint. I think Unilever's initial strategy was, well, we're going to give information that consumers need to take less time in showering, or use concentrated detergents, or you can use cold wash. Consumers have been uniformly unreceptive to those alternatives. Another phase of thinking was, we have powerful brands. Let us use the power of those brands to mobilize consumer behavior. That may work in some instances, but I think where Unilever's thinking now is, let us find other ways to offset that environmental footprint. So if we don't think we can get the consumer in the short run to change his or her behavior, we have to find more ways to offset carbon by managing forests more responsibly and entering into other kinds of global collaborations to protect the Amazon and protect other critical rainforests around the world. And so I think that we can never afford to give up on the consumer, because the consumer will ultimately adapt. We're all very intelligent. We try to be responsible to the extent possible. We live in our own set of values, and I think until we find a connection between a product that reinforces those values, we're going to be lagging indicators here. But I think that the Unilevers, the Nestles, the Volkswagens, and many of the other companies that necessarily have to invest and innovate, I would encourage them to keep doing so, because I think the rewards will be there for them.
David, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so my name is David Bach. I'm a Senior Associate Dean here at Yale School of Management. So I've been following this conversation closely, not just because of your call to action before, Terry, but I'm glad that Andy brought in consumers and that we've spoken a little bit more about consumers. And in fact, I'd like to go a step further and talk about citizens, because in fact, that customer, Kevin, that you described, who has to think about, do I get my gas on the right side on the road or do I cross over, is potentially also an investor in a mutual fund in one of those companies. And even if he or she, goes to the right gas station, if you will, they'll still want to have the other company do well, because that is what is going to help them get their retirement. And so going back to Terry's point before about board directors being taught to sort of, not just look at shareholder returns, but think in the long term, and many of these directors, of course, represent the interests of the shareholders, and it's the shareholders, and many of them, being citizens, being represented by institutional investors, who are actually looking for this, right? Because we're not satisfied with a 3 or 4% return on our portfolio. We actually want to have more. And then it is interesting. It struck me that this sort of lack of directors to willingly ignore short-term interests of the constituents they have seems to be quite similar to what we've been asking our policymakers to do, and it's been completely insufficient, right? So we're hoping our policymakers will adopt policies that are in the long run interest of a country, be it the U.S. or any other country. Yet, we have a pretty good record in the U.S. It's getting worse and worse of actually throwing people out who are trying to do something that is actually sensible and working in the long run. So without wanting to sound terribly pessimistic, a lot of this does come back to citizens, and to expect companies to compensate for a deficient political system and to compensate for the short-term focus of some citizens, both in terms of their voting behavior and in terms of the consuming behavior, seems to be very problematic. Let me throw in one other thing, perhaps just to broaden the conversation. One thing that struck me is that much of the conversation has focused on publicly traded multinationals, when we of course know that the vast majority of enterprises are private companies, family businesses and others. And lots of people here in the room actually come from countries other than the US, where that is even more the case. And there's some evidence that non-publicly traded companies, family firms and others seem to be a little bit more responsive to some of those concerns, in part because the family's invested in it, the family name is on the product. They tend to be funded by more patient capital. So I'm curious if you could share with us some thoughts on that aspect as well, the role that ownership plays in the questions you've been discussing.
So you can respond to either one.
There was more than one in there, but
Yeah.
I mean, there is it just a number of your points occur to me to just mention one paper that came out a few months ago by one of my former colleagues on the UN team, which is about the cost of conflict with communities in the extractive sector. Because I think, David, you mentioned the lack of engagement of boards, and I think part of the problem is that some of the risks that we talk about related to sustainability or human rights, they are disseminated across different functions, and they're not aggregated to the point where the costs are tallied up to the point that they'd get anybody's attention. And as one of the people who I interviewed for my book said, I have a horizontal job in a vertical world. And having sustainability and human rights cut across so many different functions. And so what this paper did was actually interview a lot of executives in extractive companies and try to tally up the costs of conflicts with local communities that are traditionally spread across extra security costs, extra community relations costs, maybe some additional legal fees, maybe some more philanthropy that you have to do, right? They're sort of atomized. And so they've put them together and come up with some numbers that really should catch the board's attention, because these sorts of sums are material from any definition of materiality. So that's just one point on sort of board engagement.
Just respond, wouldn't that then suggest that the issue isn't shareholder value? The issue is that we're not counting for externalities and we're not looking at systemic risk, as you said it before, right?
They're
I mean,
not,
this is
yeah.
even not, this is just, you know, small costs in different parts of the organization that actually add up, in addition to systemic risk as well as externalities, rather than the issue being, you know, shareholder value.
Terry or Kevin?
Yeah, I'll opine on a couple of issues. One is, I'm not arguing that we should discard shareholder value as a metric. What I'm arguing for is a much fuller dashboard of metrics that capture and represent a much more representative set of shareholders, not just shareholders who represent a small number of institutions or who make the most noise or things of that nature. I think an examination of corporate charters that boards are supposed to adhere to would lead you to a conclusion that boards have to broadly reflect the interests of the company and not just a segment of someone's interests. So that's one point I'd make. If you really want to get depressed, I will give you one statistic, and that is, in the last 2 years, when you roll up the portfolio adjustments on the Dow Jones as well as NASDAQ and other stock exchanges in New York, there has been a 37% increase in greenhouse gas intensity in portfolio adjustments in the New York exchanges. So far from thinking that the investment community or that we as individual investors are becoming more sustainability minded, I think the opposite is just the case, at least in the short run, which is why you have to be an optimist to be a proponent of sustainability. This is not a game for the short term or or for those who don't like contact sports. This is a game for those who are prepared to persist and not be denied over time. And I think over time, given the nature of systemic business risks that will face companies and drive complexity and disruption, that's why I'm much more confident. I'm a pessimist in the short run, but much more optimistic in the long run.
So, Kevin, I'll give you a chance.
I'm okay.
You're good?
Richard Wells from the Agata Business School. Yes, thank you very much. You've depressed me. Just what I was looking for. No, to some extent, and I'm struck by the fact that today we've talked a lot about large companies. And I understand it, what Yale mentioned, $7 trillion of revenues a year. That is a significant impact. But if you think about some of the things that really might make a difference going into the future, like additive manufacturing or the shared economy, they're coming out of the small companies. And what's the role of the small companies? And also, what's the danger to the large companies of getting disrupted by the small companies in terms of sustainability?
Kevin?
I mean, I think small companies do have a role to be disruptive. In some ways, it's in their interest to be disruptive because they're not cannibalizing something they already have. From where I sit in a large company, it's very interesting seeing those small companies that then get acquired. Honest Tea was acquired by, was it Coke or Pepsi?
Coca-Cola.
By Coke. There's just a whole list, Ben and Jerry's by Unilever. And there's a very interesting debate that then happens about, are they going to change the large organization or is the large organization going to change them? But nevertheless, that disruption is valuable for me inside your large corporation because I can also point to it and say, look, if we're not going to disrupt ourselves, we're going to get disrupted. So we've got to take that risk, that long-term risk ourselves to win in the long term, because otherwise somebody else is going to eat our lunch. So it has a value in itself, and it has a value certainly from my perspective as a practitioner in a large company.
Christine or Terry, you want to add to
I
that?
just agree. I think that small companies can show what's possible.
Nothing to add.
Yeah.
I think I disagree with that.
Could you just identify yourself?
Yes, Isabel Studer from Agada Business School, and I have to disagree with that. It depends. It very much depends. We have a big study in Mexico of 3,000 small, medium-sized enterprises, and these small, medium-sized enterprises tend to be not sustainable. It is not evident, and there is not enough information to actually, argue one way or another. But at least the studies that we have done is just the opposite, and it's just because there is not enough capacity. These companies do not have the information, and they cannot respond as fast. Maybe they can respond quickly to change because they are small, but and as long as they do not have the information or the awareness to know what the context is and the implications and the risks in the long term in terms of not being sustainable, I think, we cannot make that argument.
Yeah, I think that is what I'm seeing now in all of these, global initiatives that I'm part of. All of them are trying to figure out how do we reach small and medium-sized enterprises? How do we reach private companies that are maybe not the ones that are going to sign on to the WBCSD or the UN Global Compact or any of these multi-stakeholder initiatives because they don't have the capacity. And so then I think the role of business associations becomes really important. Right, so in the UN initiative that I was part of, we were very keen to engage employer associations in different countries because they're the ones that have the reach and have the contacts and can try to do some of that translation from these big global initiatives that really only, multinational corporations with sustainability teams have the capacity to implement, but then how do you translate that into companies that are busy just trying to, get their job done every day?
I think there was one other question in this area. Yeah.
I was going to shift the discussion a little bit. I'm Emily Caruso. I'm a current student here at Yale School of Management and between my first and second year. So I want to focus back on the human capital component, which I think all three of you have touched on at some point. And really, it seems to me that the industry is becoming a little bit less opportunistic in terms of finding a career path within sustainability and more deliberate. Christine, you kind of mentioned it was something you were interested in and you found an opportunity and you created it for yourself. Do you think, does this resonate with you, and do you think as it becomes more deliberate and it becomes more of an industry that we're all interested in, that companies are keeping up in terms of org structure and talent development?
Can I broaden the question just a bit to sort of go to this question of sustainability positions versus C-suite positions versus general manager positions, because that's been reflected in some of the other conversations today. Kevin, do you want to start on any of that?
Sure, and I came into the field through a career in product management, marketing and corporate strategy, landed in it, as I think many people do in the field, through volunteering for a project that ultimately became a job. I don't think people in 10 years will be saying that, but certainly most of my peers came into it, many of my peers came into it by accident. I think there is great value in being in a central sustainability role. I think but the thing I struggle with is the sustainability appreciation and willingness of people in mainstream business roles around me to incorporate that within their role. And for somebody who wants to be in this field, the thing I want to say to them is, don't try and get a job in the sustainability team in head office. It's a small team. It's tough to get a job in. Go get a job as a product manager or a marketing person or finance or whatever your interest is, and be one of the people bringing sustainability into that role, because that's what companies need to be happening inside them. I know it's not the answer you want to hear, and it's easy for me to say because I'm in the job, and I realize, there's people who'd knock me off if it meant they could get the job. But that is, and I don't want to give it up either. But that is where I think we need the transformational change. And I think your question was, are companies doing enough to sort of keep up with that?
Right. In the absence of, or as metrics evolve, how are they incentivizing people to come into these roles? How are they incentivizing people to take some of these risks, to bring in the sustainability component, to their job, even if it's not part of their description.
Right. So, and I suppose I'm always a bit conflicted about this. On the one hand, being very appreciative that my company has me and 20 other people in head office and dozens of other people in departments around the company. But as a practitioner inside a company, as your interviewees probably said, you never feel like your company's doing enough, and we always want to push it a bit further. It's not as embedded as I'd like it to be, and I hope it will be one day. And I think there's a sort of a push-pull thing with the business schools, with government, and back with customers and investors as to how we get that balance right. But we're not there yet. We need to go a lot further.
I don't know where this is going to go. I mean, 20 years ago, the sustainability job in a company, it was the departure lounge job, right? It was the job that a guy who spent 20 years with the company, like, let's give him a nice cushy post pre-retirement, and he can go sort of talk to NGOs or something. And I think there's still a little bit of that. But I don't know where this is going to go. And we spent a lot of the day talking about, should business schools be cranking out specialists in sustainability, or should it be infused? And I think it is a little bit of both. I mean, those of us in this space talk about, sort of half-jokingly, about how our job is to put ourselves out of business because we should be redundant, right? But I don't think that's but I don't think that's actually the case. I mean, companies don't do that with ethics and compliance, right? Like, yes, everybody should own ethics, but that doesn't mean, but we don't need an ethics department, right? Or you don't do that with legal. Like, yes, everybody should be acting legally, so we don't need a legal department, right? That's not true, and that's why I think there is a real role for specialists in sustainability who can be the ones to keep up to speed on the international debate, know what international best practices and what the standards are, but they also really need to know the company, know the culture, know how the business operates. But I have seen people come into sustainability roles in companies and they get stuck, right? And that's fine if that's what you want to focus on, but for people who want a broad business career, as I think many MBAs do, it's sort of other people in the company don't quite know what to do with you next, and there's sort of no place else for you to go. And again, that might be okay if that's what you want to do, but for me, I ended up sort of moving into this role in Indonesia and then in China and then in London. Before the policy role that I talked about, I did a year as a commercial analyst again, in part so that I wouldn't forget how to use Excel, but in part so that actually people in the company still knew what to do with me and knew that I was still sort of a serious business person and spoke the language of the company and was like deep inside its core commercial guts. But again, I think that the choice of how you want to have an impact in the world through your career is deeply personal. And some people might just want to focus on sustainability, and I think we need people to do that, and that's okay.
Terry, last comment from the panel?
I'm traveling to a growing number of college campuses, both in this country and elsewhere. I'm still hearing from many students who think that their career goal ought to be the chief sustainability officer at a major company. And I would never discourage anyone from achieving or trying to achieve that aspiration. But at the same time, my advice to someone who's graduating from an MBA program or has an engineering degree would be, you will maximize your opportunities for a substantial career if you're able to demonstrate that you have a very significant core competency. That competency could be civil engineering, it could be finance, it could be marketing, it could be IT. Once you've entered the career path within an Accenture or a DuPont or any other kind of organization, then I think your career is increasingly dependent upon your non-technical skills, your ability to work in teams across multiple cultures and time zones, your ability to be an effective interpersonal communicator with your colleagues inside the company or externally with customers or stakeholders, your ability to function in different cultures, your ability to be able to expand your role beyond life cycle analysis or finance, and to grow your own portfolio. So when you think of your career, you're not just investing in your initial job. You want to position and think about how you set yourself up for the second or third or fourth job within that organization, simply because you're not going to be spending much time, chances are, in that initial position that you were recruited for. So don't overshoot, but don't undershoot. And I'm finding that companies are more and more comfortable with what I would call organized chaos. So, for example, Boeing has 40 separate green teams within the company that rove around the company. These are collaborations of employees that cross business units, and their mission is to create business value. But how are they doing it? They're doing it through a sustainability lens. At the same time, they're connecting the other lenses that exist within a company like Boeing. So perhaps your best skill over time is to know how to integrate people and information in order to create value. To me, that's what sustainability is. It's creating value for both business but simultaneously for society. One last thought I have in all this.
Very quick.
Universities, you have competition, because on issues like natural capital valuation, new accounting models, companies aren't necessarily turning to universities to develop that knowledge. They're turning to the Nature Conservancy. They're turning to the Environmental Defense Fund. Or for future employee development, they may be turning to community colleges. That's what Volkswagen's doing in its largest manufacturing plant in the U.S. in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They're not partnering with big MBA programs. They're partnering with the local community college to implant their global apprenticeship model as part of talent development, sustainability, and career path planning. So whatever you think is the norm and the status quo today, don't check out of your attention span for too long, because it will likely change.
Great warning with which to leave everybody. If you could join me in thanking the panel for planning this session. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dean Snyder from the School of Management, who will offer some closing remarks here on thinking about management education in the future here. The thing that I'd like to thank Dean Snyder for.
You could skip the intro.
Yeah, I'm about to thank you.
Oh, but you can.
Okay. He's been unbelievable in creating space for sustainability initiatives here, both on campus and across the global network. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Brad. I wanted to thank the panelists. I really enjoyed it. Kevin, Christine, Terry. What I'd like to talk about is how students here, faculty here, staff, people with industry connections can think about this week, not so much as solving the many problems in sustainability, but rather in terms of how do you build an infrastructure, if you will, that can actually move us forward and allow us to be more effective in the work. I am not an expert on sustainability. I alternated between being depressed and really depressed during the last conversation. But I did listen to particular things said by the esteemed panel. If I heard it correctly, Kevin said something to the effect of, well, if you're a national government, and I would add the friendly amendment, if you're just a national enterprise or organization, you're not going to see everything compared to a global company like yours. And I think Christine noted the point that, it's interesting. There's really no charter around sustainability. There's nothing analogous to the list of human rights. There's no, okay, let me look at principle number 9 and see if I'm following it. That's really agreed upon, not necessarily followed, but at least agreed upon in principle. And Terry said, not only mentioned the keyword, complexity, at the beginning, he also pointed out it's extraordinarily difficult for entities around the world to work with each other. Now, I've been in management education for a long time. Let me just give you my spin on this. There are 13,000 business schools in the world. Now, I will take a shot at Terry because he took a couple shots at these. The reason why there's so many business schools is that the MBA has been the most successful professional degree in the last 100 years. The fact that it's gone down a little bit in the last couple of years is okay. It doesn't mean that there's criticisms about where it needs to go or off the mark, but we have a lot of business schools. We have 13,000 business schools. That makes it extraordinarily hard for global companies or faculty or governments or nonprofits or entities in the social sector or that would-be systems, I can't remember the term, the person who would really become the iconic systems analyst to emerge. Maybe it's the nature of the beast. Maybe, Andrew, you'll figure it all out, okay? Please. But we make it hard for you guys, I would say. So, and David, did you cover the network?
Yeah, we talked a bit about it this morning.
And did you go through the slides?
We did also.
Okay, so I don't need to do this. Okay. I can just.
We use the same cover slide, so everybody now knows that we're perfectly aligned. Or they think that we only have one deck that we all share.
Okay. So then the only reason why to do this is to give you my email address. Okay. But my point is, when you get into your ideation sessions later on in the week, you know, I realize you want to attack certain problems, but this is not just a conference like any other conference. This is the first Global Network Week of the Global Network for Advanced Management. And I think that the quotes that I picked out, not verbatim, reflect a fundamental problem in trying to deal with these issues. And what the Global Network affords to our students and to our faculty and faculty around the network and students around the network and people with connections to industry is a way to get a much better sense of what's going on. And it is so complex and companies are so global that I think if you don't have a network of the top 27 business schools in the world, you're just going to get so confused and be unable to say, okay, this is what's going on here, and get some reasonable way to get started. And I would just like to give a shout out to my colleagues because the Forestry and Environmental Studies School has done just great work in getting this stuff organized on this dimension. You're our leaders. Thank you. And there's an invitation in all this. What else do we do? We had last year, okay, so you've gone through Global Network Weeks. You've gone through the small network online courses. You've gone through Global Network events. Have you gone through the case competitions?
You mentioned cases and then also the Geithner. We didn't talk about the integrated leadership case. We talked about the Geithner.
A lot of schools have case competitions. We can take those global. Most of these things, you know, when we started the network 28 months ago with a white paper, we didn't know what we were going to do. And the ideas are coming from people in the network. I'll just underscore that invitation. I had no idea that we would have a course on natural capital. But this thing is taking off. And the more times the nodes get hit, the more exciting it is. So with that, I'll just say thank you. It's really exciting that you're here at Yale, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Are you willing to take any questions?
I am, but I'm also mindful of the fact you've had a heck of a long day. So I am certainly happy.
Isabel Studer again. Thank you very much for hosting this. Good to see you too. You talked about complexity, and I think that's a great issue. And Terry mentioned that, and I think that all the discussion was around mainly transformation and what does it take really, for an individual to make this change. It is not easy because we're thinking about, fundamental systemic transformation, not only in the enterprise or, the nations or any organization, as Terry mentioned. But what about complexity? I mean, because it's not easy just to say how we change, how we instill this transformational change. What kind of skills at Yale, at the School of Management, are you teaching or developing in terms of dealing with complexity, while at the same time, because leadership is a big thing, in every business school. And, maybe not, we don't have many theories of systemic change. I'm an internationalist, and I do know, there is a lot of discussion about that. But complexity, how do you teach that? What kind of programs do you have at Yale, or, have other examples in terms of how to deal with that complexity?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a good opportunity for me to say, I don't know, and be absolutely, completely humble. Because I think what the world faces now with globalization, which is still very much ongoing, and the technology revolution, which is still very much ongoing, we just haven't seen anything like these two forces contributing to complexity and the acceleration of complexity. I just can't imagine it. We have we had the pleasure of having Tom Friedman here, and he pointed out that the Gutenberg moment took a long time, whereas what's happened in the last 7 years to make us uber connected has happened in 7 years. And your question about teaching complexity is, and how to, is I don't know. I don't know how we do it. My answer, nevertheless, for what it's worth, is the network and connectivity. You still have to teach frameworks. I believe the reason why business schools have become so successful, and the MBA has become the most popular professional degree of all time. 25% of professional degrees are MBAs. So if you want to take into account the pricing, the value percentage is a lot higher. It's because they teach how organizations work and how markets function. And if you go to a good school and you learn those two things, you can do a lot. Okay? So you got to get the frameworks. But if you then say, on top of that, I'm connected to you. And I'm connected here. And by the way, there's a great opportunity over here. Oh, there's a pile of crap over here. And, oh, I think of the top 5, this is literally the case. When I asked US students, what are the top 5 issues facing business and society? Okay, I'll get the list. And then I asked, David was there, I asked our Masters of Advanced Management students who come to Yale to extend their studies from the member schools, what's your number 1? Not on the list, the previous list whatsoever. So how do you teach that? I think you have to position yourself. That's my bottom line answer. I think you have to position yourself where you're connected. And the only way I can think of it is embed yourself in the network. It's very consistent with Terry's answer about how to think about one's career. You keep putting yourself in a position where you're always broadening, adding to your portfolio, and it's a disciplined professional development process. Thank you. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, everyone, thank you very much for everyone attending in the room and for those tuning in online.